It was supposed to be a routine flight, a quick trip from New York to Miami. The kind of journey Layla Jones had dreamed about when she first thought of becoming a flight attendant. She imagined herself smiling warmly at passengers, serving drinks with a steady hand, and gliding through the narrow aisles as though she owned the space. But today, things would take a turn that no training manual could have prepared her for. Somewhere around the second hour of this flight, her life would change forever, and the events would leave everyone on board stunned. Layla was new to the job, having joined SkyLuxe Airlines only a few months ago. Though she was still learning the ropes, her natural grace and calm demeanor had made her a favorite among some of her more senior colleagues. Others, however, were less impressed. "Don't get too comfortable," one of them had told her during her first week. "This job's not as glamorous as it looks." Layla had smiled politely, choosing to focus on the positive. She had worked hard to get here, and she wasn't going to let negativity cloud her enthusiasm. Today, she moved with quiet confidence, her blue uniform crisp and spotless. Her curly hair was pinned neatly into a bun, and her eyes scanned the cabin for anything out of place. The flight had taken off without issue. Passengers settled into their seats, some pulling out laptops, others leaning back for a quick nap. The familiar hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin, mingling with the occasional murmur of conversation. Layla found comfort in the routine of it all, the clinking of glasses in the galley, the soft rustle of newspapers, the rhythmic beep of the service buttons. As she passed by row 3, her eyes briefly flicked to the man in seat 3A. He was dressed casually, wearing a simple gray hoodie and jeans. A baseball cap was pulled low over his face, making it hard to get a clear look at him. He didn't seem to be in any rush to make conversation or draw attention to himself. To Layla, he was just another passenger, someone she could serve without much thought. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she asked as she paused by his seat. Without looking up, the man responded in a quiet, steady voice. "I'm fine, thank you." Layla nodded and moved on. He wasn't the only one keeping to himself. Most of the passengers seemed content to stay quiet, engrossed in their own worlds. A woman across the aisle was flipping through a fashion magazine, her manicured nails glinting under the overhead light. A businessman a few rows back was furiously typing on his laptop, occasionally muttering to himself. Layla took it all in as she continued her rounds, ensuring that every passenger was comfortable. The first hour passed uneventfully, and Layla began to relax into the flow of the flight. But just as she was beginning to think the rest of the journey would be smooth sailing, she noticed Carla, one of the senior flight attendants, standing at the front of the cabin with her arms crossed. Carla was known for her sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude. She was the kind of person who believed in hierarchy, and to her, Layla was just the rookie. Carla's eyes narrowed as she watched Layla handle a request from a passenger in row 6. "Don't forget to double-check the drink orders," Carla called out, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Layla bit her lip and nodded. "Yes, ma'am," she replied, keeping her tone polite. Carla smirked and walked away, her heels clicking against the floor. Layla took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay professional. She couldn't afford to lose focus, not when she was still proving herself in this role. As she continued her work, Layla couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. It wasn't the usual curiosity of passengers observing the crew, this felt different. Glancing over her shoulder, her eyes met those of the man in 3A. He wasn't staring, exactly, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made her pause. For a moment, Layla wondered if she had done something wrong. Was he unhappy with the service? Had she forgotten to bring him something? But before she could dwell on it, he looked away, turning his attention to the window. The interaction was brief, but it left Layla feeling unsettled. The second hour of the flight began, and with it came a shift in the atmosphere. A minor patch of turbulence jolted the plane, causing a few gasps from passengers. Layla instinctively reached out to steady herself against the seat backs. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," came a calm voice over the intercom. "We're experiencing a bit of turbulence, but nothing to worry about. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened." Layla offered reassuring smiles to those who looked nervous, making her way down the aisle to check on everyone. When she reached row 3 again, she noticed the man in 3A had his hands folded in his lap, his posture relaxed despite the bumps. "You're handling the turbulence better than most," she said lightly, trying to ease the tension in the cabin. The man glanced up briefly, offering a small smile. "I've been through worse," he replied, his tone unreadable. Layla chuckled softly and moved on, but a nagging curiosity lingered in the back of her mind. There was something about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. As the turbulence subsided, the cabin seemed to settle again. Passengers resumed their activities, and Layla returned to her duties. But the sense of normalcy was short-lived. "Excuse me, miss," a woman's sharp voice rang out from first class. Layla turned to see an elegantly dressed passenger waving her hand impatiently. The woman's face was twisted into a scowl, her perfectly styled hair bouncing as she gestured for attention. "Yes, ma'am, how can I help you?" Layla asked, keeping her tone calm and friendly. "This is unacceptable," the woman snapped. "I specifically requested sparkling water, not still. Do you not listen to your passengers?" Layla apologized and quickly retrieved the correct drink, all while feeling Carla's eyes boring into her from across the cabin. She could almost hear the senior attendant's internal monologue, "The rookie messed up again." By the time Layla returned to the galley, she felt drained. But there was no time to rest. Another call light dinged, and she was back in the aisle, navigating the endless stream of requests and complaints. Through it all, the man in 3A remained quiet, observing the scene with an expression that gave nothing away. What no one on the plane knew, what even Layla couldn't have guessed, was that everything happening now was leading up to a moment that would change her life. By the time the flight landed in Miami, the name of the man in 3A would be on everyone's lips. And Layla's world would never be the same again. It began innocently enough, as most things do. Layla, ever the picture of professionalism, approached seat 3A with her usual polite smile. She leaned in slightly, careful not to disturb the other passengers around him. "Sir, can I get you anything?" she asked, her tone warm and inviting. The man didn't look up right away. His head remained tilted slightly downward, the brim of his baseball cap casting a shadow over his face. After a moment, he muttered, "I'm fine," in a voice so calm it was almost dismissive. Layla nodded, her smile unwavering. "Just let me know if you need anything," she said softly, before moving down the aisle to tend to other passengers. For a moment, she thought nothing more of him. Passengers like him weren't uncommon, quiet, reserved, and uninterested in small talk. Layla had learned not to take it personally. But as the flight went on, she would begin to notice small things about him, things that seemed to set him apart. It started when an elderly passenger in seat 4B, just behind him, flagged her down. The woman was petite, with silver hair neatly tucked into a bun. She struggled with her carry-on bag, which had shifted during takeoff and was now wedged awkwardly in the overhead compartment. "Excuse me, dear," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "Could you help me with this? I can't seem to get it down." "Of course," Layla replied, springing into action. She reached up and carefully adjusted the bag, taking care not to disturb the other passengers nearby. The effort took only a moment, and the woman smiled warmly in gratitude. "You're very kind," she said. Layla was about to respond when Carla, one of the senior flight attendants, appeared behind her. Carla was tall and sharp-featured, with a permanent look of disapproval etched onto her face. "Typical," Carla muttered under her breath, but loud enough for Layla to hear. Always trying to look busy when there's a simple job to do. Layla stiffened. The words stung more than she cared to admit, but she refused to let them show on her face. Instead, she stepped back, giving Carla room to pass. "Yes, ma'am," Layla said quietly, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. Carla didn't bother to reply. She simply swept down the aisle, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. Layla took a deep breath and forced herself to refocus. She couldn't afford to get distracted, not when she still had so much to prove. As she turned back toward the elderly passenger, she caught sight of the man in 3A. His gaze had shifted ever so slightly, and for the first time, she realized he was watching her. It wasn't an intrusive stare, but there was something about the way his eyes followed her movements that made her pause. He didn't say a word. He didn't even change his expression. But Layla couldn't shake the feeling that he had noticed more than she wanted him to. The moment passed, and Layla moved on, but the weight of his silent observation stayed with her. The turbulence began about 30 minutes later. At first, it was nothing more than a faint tremor, the kind passengers barely noticed. But soon, the plane started to shake more noticeably, causing drinks to ripple and passengers to glance nervously at one another. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," came the steady voice over the intercom. "We're experiencing a little turbulence. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened. This should pass shortly." Layla had been through turbulence before. It was part of the job, and she knew exactly how to handle it. She moved down the aisle with practiced ease, offering smiles and reassurances to anyone who looked particularly uneasy. "Everything's fine," she told a young mother cradling a fussy baby. "It'll settle down soon." As she reached the front of the cabin, the plane gave a sudden jolt, and several drinks spilled onto the tray tables. Gasps echoed through the cabin as passengers scrambled to keep their belongings from tumbling to the floor. Layla immediately began handing out napkins, doing her best to calm the situation. "I'll take care of that for you," she said to a man who was frantically dabbing at his shirt. "Just stay seated, I'll clean this up." As she worked, she felt that same unsettling sensation again, the feeling of being watched. Glancing over her shoulder, she saw the man in 3A looking at her. This time, his gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. It wasn't the look of someone judging her or even someone annoyed by the situation. It was something else entirely. It was as if he was studying her, taking in every detail of how she handled herself. Layla hesitated for just a moment before forcing herself to turn away. She couldn't let herself get distracted, not now. The turbulence began to subside, and the cabin slowly returned to a semblance of calm. Passengers resumed their conversations, though a faint buzz of tension still lingered in the air. Layla made her way back to the galley, where Carla was already waiting. "You need to be faster," Carla snapped, not bothering to lower her voice. "Passengers don't like waiting." "Yes, ma'am," Layla said again, her tone as polite as ever. Carla rolled her eyes and walked away, leaving Layla alone to catch her breath. She leaned against the counter for a moment, letting the hum of the engines fill the silence around her. When she stepped back into the aisle, the man in 3A was still watching. This time, she didn't look away. Their eyes met briefly, and for a split second, Layla thought she saw a flicker of something in his expression. Was it curiosity? Approval? Or something else entirely? Whatever it was, she didn't have time to dwell on it. A passenger in row 7 had pressed the call button, and Layla hurried over to assist. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that the man in 3A had seen something in her that no one else had. And she couldn't help but wonder what it was. As the hours passed on the flight, Layla's patience and skills were put to the test. It began with small things: a passenger ringing the call button twice because their drink order took a minute too long, or a child spilling a juice box on the aisle carpet. These were the kinds of things Layla could handle without breaking a sweat. She smiled, stayed polite, and moved quickly to solve the problems. But things escalated when a woman in first class began to cause a scene. The woman was dressed in an elegant, expensive-looking outfit. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her jewelry sparkled every time she moved her hands, which she did often as she gestured dramatically. "This is completely unacceptable," the woman barked, her voice loud enough to draw attention from other passengers. Layla hurried over to her seat, putting on her best customer service smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am. How can I help you?" The woman turned to Layla with an expression of exaggerated disbelief. She held up the glass of water on her tray table as though it were evidence in a court case. "This is still water," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "I specifically asked for sparkling. Do you not listen to your passengers?" Layla felt a small knot of frustration form in her stomach, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she nodded and apologized. "I'm so sorry about that, ma'am. Let me fix it for you right away." She quickly went back to the galley, poured a fresh glass of sparkling water, and returned within moments. She placed the glass carefully on the woman's tray table and smiled again. "Here you go, ma'am. I hope this is better." The woman stared at Layla for a long moment, then leaned back in her seat with a dramatic sigh. "Honestly, do you even know who I am?" she asked, her tone sharp and condescending. Layla didn't respond immediately. She had learned during her training that the best way to handle difficult passengers was to remain calm and professional. "I apologize for the inconvenience," she said again, keeping her voice steady. The woman huffed but finally turned her attention back to her magazine, flipping the pages with unnecessary force. Layla let out a quiet breath of relief and stepped away, eager to leave the woman's negativity behind. But the peace didn't last long. Not far from the scene in first class, something else was brewing. The man in seat 3A, who had been quiet and unassuming for most of the flight, was suddenly the focus of attention. It began when Carla, the senior flight attendant, approached his seat with a forced smile plastered on her face. Carla's smile was the kind that didn't reach her eyes, the kind that made Layla feel uneasy whenever she saw it. "Excuse me, sir," Carla said, her tone overly sweet, almost mocking. "I couldn't help but notice you're sitting in first class. This area is reserved for priority guests. Did you buy this seat?" The man didn't respond immediately. He remained seated, his posture relaxed, his head still tilted downward as though he hadn't heard her. Layla, who was standing a few rows away, felt a pang of discomfort. Something about Carla's tone didn't sit right with her. "Sir," Carla said again, this time louder. "I asked if you bought this seat." Slowly, the man raised his head. The brim of his baseball cap lifted just enough to reveal his eyes sharp, observant, and unwavering. For a moment, he looked directly at Carla, his gaze calm but piercing. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said, his voice steady and low. Carla blinked, clearly caught off guard by his confidence. But instead of backing off, she pressed on. "You see," she said, her forced smile tightening, "this section is for passengers who've paid for first class. If you don't have the proper ticket, we'll have to move you to the correct seat." The man didn't flinch. He didn't argue or raise his voice. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his seat, his movements slow and deliberate. "I understand," he said. "But I'm not moving." Layla watched the interaction with growing unease. She could feel the tension building, not just between Carla and the man, but in the entire cabin. Passengers were beginning to notice, their heads turning to watch the exchange. Carla's smile disappeared entirely. Her tone became sharper, more accusatory. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass." The man didn't move. His expression remained calm, but there was something in his demeanor that shifted ever so slightly. His jaw tightened, and his eyes seemed to harden. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still calm but carrying an undeniable weight, "I suggest you stop." Carla blinked again, this time with visible confusion. "Excuse me," she said, her voice wavering slightly. Layla, who had been standing frozen, finally stepped forward. "Carla," she said softly, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Maybe we should check with the flight manifest before." Carla cut her off with a sharp glance. "Stay out of this, Layla," she snapped. "I've got it under control." But Carla didn't have it under control. Layla could see it in the way her hands fidgeted with the edge of her uniform, in the way her voice had lost its earlier confidence. The man in 3A didn't respond to Carla's last remark. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a sleek smartphone, and began typing something. His movements were calm, almost methodical, but there was an unmistakable air of authority about him now. Layla couldn't help but notice the way the cabin seemed to shift around him. Passengers who had been watching the scene began whispering to one another, their curiosity and unease growing with every passing second. Finally, Carla stepped back, clearly unsure of what to do next. She glanced around the cabin, as though searching for backup, but no one came to her aid. Layla wanted to speak up, to say something that might diffuse the tension, but before she could, the man in 3A spoke again. "I think you've made your point," he said, his tone cool and measured. "Now, if you're done, I'd like to enjoy the rest of my flight." His words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, Carla stepped back, her face a mixture of frustration and confusion. Layla watched her retreat down the aisle, feeling a strange mix of relief and apprehension. She turned back to the man in 3A, who had already returned to his relaxed posture, his attention seemingly focused elsewhere. But as Layla moved to continue her duties, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it. The man in 3A wasn't just another passenger, there was something about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. And she was starting to think that by the time this flight was over, everyone on board would know exactly who he was. The tension had been building for what felt like hours, and by now, the entire cabin was on edge. Carla's frustration with the man in 3A had reached a boiling point, and her forced smile was gone, replaced by a tight-lipped glare. Layla watched from a few rows away, her heart pounding. She didn't know how things would end, but she knew it wouldn't be good. Carla marched back toward 3A, her heels clicking loudly on the cabin floor. She stood over the man with her arms crossed, glaring down at him. "Sir, I've asked you twice to show me your boarding pass," she said, her voice sharp and cutting. "If you can't produce it, I will have no choice but to remove you from this seat." The man didn't flinch. He sat back, his posture relaxed, his face calm. "Ma'am, I've told you already. I'm exactly where I need to be," he said, his voice steady but firm. Carla leaned closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "If you don't cooperate, I'll call security the moment we land. Do you understand me?" At that moment, something shifted in the man's expression. He didn't look angry or frightened. Instead, he looked tired. Tired of the assumptions, the arrogance, the way Carla had been trying to assert her authority over him from the start. Layla felt frozen in place. She wanted to step in, to stop this before it went any further, but she wasn't sure how. And before she could do anything, Carla made her move. "Sir, you need to." She reached out to grab the man's arm, her fingers brushing against the fabric of his jacket. What happened next shocked everyone on the plane. A loud slap echoed through the cabin. It was sharp, startling, and unmistakable. Gasps erupted from the passengers as they turned to see what had happened. Carla stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek. Her face was a mixture of shock and disbelief. She stared at the man in 3A, her mouth open as though she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "You're done," the man said, his voice low and cold, cutting through the stunned silence like a knife. And so is your career. The cabin was so quiet that Layla could hear the faint hum of the engines, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Passengers whispered to one another, their voices hushed but urgent. What just happened? Someone murmured. Did he just slap her? Another asked, incredulous. The man in 3A didn't wait for Carla to recover. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. Layla couldn't take her eyes off him. There was something about the way he moved, calm, confident, completely unbothered by the chaos around him. The captain emerged from the cockpit, his face a mask of concern. What's going on here? He demanded, his eyes darting between Carla and the man. Carla finally found her voice. He assaulted me, she said, pointing at the man in 3A. Her voice was shrill, filled with a mixture of anger and fear. You need to do something. The captain turned to the man, who was now typing something on his phone with precision. Sir, we need to de-escalate the situation, the captain said, trying to remain calm. The man looked up, his gaze steady and piercing. You don't recognize me, do you? He asked, his voice smooth and unhurried. The captain blinked, clearly confused. Sir, I... The man didn't wait for him to finish. He raised his phone, tapping a few more keys with a practiced hand. Within moments, a series of notifications began to buzz and ping. Layla's own phone, tucked away in her pocket, vibrated. She pulled it out hesitantly, her heart racing. When she saw the message on the screen, her breath caught in her throat. The message was simple but unmistakable. Attention all SkyLuxe Airlines crew. Immediate updates incoming. All around the cabin, members of the crew were pulling out their phones, their faces pale as they read the messages flooding in. Carla's face twisted in confusion and then horror as she reached for her own device. The man in 3A looked up, his eyes scanning the cabin. You all assumed, didn't you? He said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made everyone fall silent. Layla felt her pulse quicken as the pieces began to fall into place. She didn't know exactly who this man was, but it was clear now that he wasn't just any passenger. Carla's voice broke the silence, shaky and unsure. Who are you? She asked, her bravado completely gone. The man turned to her, his gaze steady. Ethan Monroe, he said simply. The name landed like a thunderclap. Layla's eyes widened, and a collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Ethan Monroe. The CEO of SkyLuxe Airlines. The man who owned the very company they worked for. Carla's face went white as realization dawned. Oh my God, she whispered, taking a step back. Ethan didn't move. He remained standing, his presence commanding the room without any effort. You thought I was just another passenger, he said, his tone even. You thought you could treat me like I didn't belong. Carla opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Ethan continued, his voice growing firmer. I've been watching this crew all flight. I've seen who's professional and who isn't. I've seen who respects their job and who abuses their power. His eyes flicked to Carla. And you, Carla, have made it very clear where you stand. Tears welled up in Carla's eyes as she stammered, Mr. Monroe, I didn't know. That's the problem, Ethan interrupted, his voice cold. You didn't know, and you didn't care. Layla stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was witnessing. Ethan turned to the captain. I trust you'll handle the situation appropriately, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The captain nodded quickly, his face pale. Yes, sir. Of course, sir. Ethan glanced at Layla, his expression softening slightly. For a moment, their eyes met, and she felt a strange sense of reassurance. Then, without another word, he sat back down in his seat, pulling his baseball cap lower over his face. The cabin was silent for a long moment, the weight of what had just happened settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. Layla felt a strange mix of emotions: shock, relief, and a quiet, growing admiration for the man who had just stood up to Carla in a way no one else ever had. By the time the flight landed, the entire crew knew one thing for certain: no one would ever forget the day they crossed paths with Ethan Monroe. Ethan's piercing gaze swept across the room, finally settling on Carla. His calm demeanor didn't waver, but his words carried the weight of authority that silenced everyone in the cabin. "It's people like you," he began, his voice low but firm, "who tarnish the reputation of my airline. Effective immediately, you're relieved of duty." Carla's face went pale. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen in place, as though she couldn't quite process what had just been said. Then her mouth opened, and she stammered, "Mr. Monroe, I didn't mean." Ethan raised a hand to stop her, his expression cold and unyielding. "Don't waste my time with excuses," he said. "I've seen enough." The cabin erupted into murmurs as passengers whispered to each other in shock. Some even clapped quietly, relieved that someone had finally put Carla in her place. Layla stood near the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as she tried to absorb what was happening. She wanted to feel sorry for Carla, but after everything that had happened, all she felt was a sense of justice. Security officers were waiting at the gate when the plane landed. As soon as the doors opened, they stepped on board, their presence sending a ripple of tension through the cabin. Carla's composure crumbled completely. "You can't do this," she hissed at Ethan, her voice trembling. "I've been with this airline for years. You can't just fire me like this." Ethan didn't flinch. His voice remained calm, but his words were final. "I can, and I have. Your behavior is unacceptable, and it ends today." The officers gestured for Carla to step forward. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the cabin as though looking for someone to help her. No one moved. The passengers and crew watched in silence as she was escorted off the plane, her heels clicking loudly on the floor. As soon as she was gone, a heavy silence filled the cabin. Then, almost as if on cue, the passengers erupted into applause. It wasn't loud or boisterous, it was the kind of applause that carried relief, as though everyone had been waiting for this moment. Layla stood frozen near the galley, unsure of what to do or say. Her heart was pounding, and her thoughts were a jumbled mess. She had never witnessed anything like this before. She glanced toward Ethan, who was still standing near his seat, his phone in his hand. Then, to her surprise, Ethan turned toward her. His expression softened as he met her gaze, and for the first time since the flight had started, she saw a hint of warmth in his eyes. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quiet but clear. Layla blinked, caught off guard. "Layla Jones," she stammered, feeling her cheeks flush. Ethan nodded slowly, as though committing her name to memory. "Layla," he said, "you handled yourself with grace under pressure. You didn't let the situation overwhelm you, and you treated every passenger with respect." Layla's throat tightened, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She felt a lump forming in her throat, and her eyes began to sting with tears. Ethan continued, his tone firm but kind. "People like you are the reason this airline has a reputation for excellence. You deserve more recognition than you've been given." He paused, looking around the cabin before returning his gaze to her. "Effective immediately, I'm promoting you to head flight attendant." Layla's eyes widened, and she felt her breath catch in her chest. "Head flight attendant," she repeated, barely able to believe what she was hearing. "Yes," Ethan said simply. "You've earned it." The cabin erupted into applause once again, this time louder and more genuine. Passengers smiled at Layla, some even cheering her name. Layla felt her cheeks flush as she blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the sudden wave of emotion. Thank you," she managed to say, her voice shaky but sincere. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Ethan replied with a small smile. "Just keep doing what you're doing." As the passengers began to gather their belongings and prepare to disembark, Layla stood in a daze, her mind replaying everything that had happened. She couldn't believe how much her life had changed in just a few short hours. When the last passenger had left the plane, Ethan approached her once more. "One last thing," he said, his tone serious but kind. "If anyone ever treats you the way Carla did, you let me know. My airline doesn't tolerate disrespect, not from passengers, and certainly not from its staff." Layla nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Monroe," she said. "Call me Ethan," he replied with a small smile. As he stepped off the plane, Layla stood by the door, watching him go. She felt a sense of pride and relief she had never experienced before. For the first time in her career, she felt truly seen and valued. Later that evening, as she sat in her small apartment, Layla replayed the events of the day in her mind. She couldn't help but smile as she thought about Ethan's words. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but now she felt ready for whatever challenges came her way. The next day, as news of the incident spread, Layla's name was mentioned in glowing terms. Passengers who had been on the flight shared stories of her kindness and professionalism, and even her colleagues began to treat her with newfound respect. For Layla, it wasn't just about the promotion or the applause. It was about knowing that her hard work and integrity had been noticed by someone who truly mattered. And as she prepared for her next flight, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Sometimes, she thought, life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it.